Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Welcome back, Curious Hearts. This is episode 30, Infinite Divinities or Infinite Divinity. And this episode is maybe one that I have been the most nervous to make because we get in trouble when we start using the G word. I learned a long time ago inside of a yoga practice and teaching that when I start talking about God, people have so many experiences with that word, with the way that people have used that word to justify unjustifiable behavior, that people standing in front of that word have caused real serious harm. Like people have been really hurt by what that word represents for them. And so as soon as I start thinking about, talking about spirituality, I have to be careful. And I think it's wise for all of us to be aware of that and to be cautious how we talk about God when we talk about God. This podcast is not really about if God exists or doesn't exist, because honestly, in my opinion, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you agree with me or disagree with me. It does not matter if we believe that the divine looks the same or feels the same or does the same things. I actually think that that is maybe one of the least important things about this kind of conversation and these conversations. That the most important thing for me in my own personal spiritual life and practice, and I think for every one of you and for people in the world, is that we each have a safe and reliable place that we can come back to and be asking those questions, to be living inside of the questions about what is the nature of God? Does God exist? Is God real? I love the definition of God as the blanket that we throw over the mystery. And that may be the only thing that I will come back to on a regular basis to talk about in a public way, because my current perception or current opinion about the nature of the divine infinite majesty is pretty irrelevant to how useful I can be in the world. Feels important for me in this moment to just pause and acknowledge. I hope that these episodes are relevant regardless of when you listen to them or watch them. And I am recording this episode in the middle of January of 2026, and the year has kicked off with a lot of chaos and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear in the world. And it is both reminding me why this work feels so important and also why it feels so hard. There was an episode that I released last year where we talked about a specific flavor of the divine from the Christian faith. And it's probably the most watched and responded to episode that I've shared so far. And the responses were not great. The responses were not from people who are regular listeners. They're from people who have a really strong feeling about who God is and who's allowed to talk about God and who isn't allowed to talk about God. And because of that, there has always been, I think, a hesitancy for those of us who aren't sure, who don't know, who aren't willing to make a firm commitment about what is correct when it comes to the divine. That we are concerned that by standing up and saying, I don't know what God looks like or what God does, or I don't know if this is God's plan, or maybe that's not, what that divine teacher meant when they said, love thy neighbor as thyself, for example. And I want to just recognize and acknowledge how important it is for me to continue to have these conversations in moments like these. Because I think those of us who continue to wrestle with these deep questions inside of our searching hearts, we need the place to be in some amount of uncertainty. We need a place that is safe to be questioning and to be curious and to be exploring and playing and maybe discovering, forgetting and then remembering what the divine's role is in each of our lives and what our relationship is to that divine being, that divine presence. So, that being said, what we're talking about today is one very specific aspect of this. And we could probably talk for hours and hours about the nature of God and all of the different traditions that are brought forward. But I want to start with one tiny story that I remember hearing as a teenager. When I was growing up, I used to go to a Unitarian church because my mom said, thanks, Mom, that I couldn't go to youth group if I wasn't going to church. And I remember very little, to be honest, about those church sessions that, Sunday mornings. But I really remember this one moment of a children's story. There was always a story or a little excerpt that was given before the kids went off to Sunday school. And this story was a parable about a number of different people climbing the same mountain. One found a well-worn path that had very clear steps and they could walk step by step, and it was very clear the pathway, and they could see, there were moments of arriving and, being able to pause and go to the vista and then walking up some more and then to being able to pause. And it was a slow and steady path up the side of that mountain. Another seeker, another traveler who, as they climbed or crawled up that mountain, found themselves in tremendous brush, and they were having to constantly pull thorns out of their skin and clear away because nothing else had been there before. And yet another climber, seeker, who was following a path that had been left behind by animals, and it wasn't as clear as the first well-worn path, but there were tiny moments of noticing another living being, not a human, but another living being on the path, and sort of noticing, oh, and that great eagle set a nest there, and here is a bear's hutch, and so forth. For the adults in the audience, it was a pretty on the nose parable, right? We're all on our way up the same mountain. We just find different paths. And some of us follow well-worn paths, and others of us build our own, and still others find different ways. And we're all on our way up the same mountain. But that story has stuck with me for a really long time. And it is my entry point into our conversation today, because often what happens on our own personal spiritual journey is we find our way up one particular path. We find that we have been following the well-worn path, the stairs that somebody else carved into the mountainside for us many centuries ago, maybe. And at some point, we find ourselves wandering off the path. We begin to realize that there are probably an infinite number of ways to go up, and that we don't have to follow someone else's path, especially if it doesn't feel right for us. And that many of us, when we arrive at a podcast like this or our own personal spiritual practice, we've had many, many experiences of that. And what led me to this specific topic was an experience like that. For a long time, I had no religious or spiritual practice at all. And through some real rough moments, I made a conscious decision to believe in something that was bigger than I am. And because I grew up in a Christian setting, right? I grew up in the United States. It's a predominantly Christian culture. That was the image that I knew. That was the one that made the most sense to me. And so I began to try on a relationship with this sky daddy, right? This like reliable, ever present, wise, paternal figure. And it was helpful for me for a very long time. And over the course of many years and all sorts of twists and turns, my experience with the divine shifted some. And obviously, my yoga practice had a lot of influence, and my 12-step experience had a lot of influence. But across the board, I was always sort of trying on relationships with divine images, divine beings. An old friend suggested to me once that if my relationship, my concept of a higher power wasn't working for me, that a great exercise was to sit down and write a job description. Like, what does my God need? What do I need from that relationship? What do I need to know for sure? All of that. And then you write the job description and then you hire that divine being. You hire that higher power. That had always been my relationship. It had always been a relationship between me, my being, and one infinite being. And that one infinite being, first of all, was impossible for my mind to conceive of because the human mind can't really fathom that. In the same way, we can't understand what zero actually means. We have no capacity to imagine what infinity is, right? With something that is boundless. We can attempt, but because we have limitations by our very nature, just by the algorithm that we've been given, right? Our basic operating system says there are limits. And so understanding something that is limitless is at best an intellectual exercise, but is not something that I could ever really wrap my brain around. So I often found myself, whether I realized it or not, feeling like my relationship with the divine, as important as it was, that they had a lot of other stuff going on. There were a lot of other people in the world. There was a lot of other stuff to be doing. And I could never quite have this feeling like that presence was with me all the time. Until I had a moment of real existential struggle. And I realized that I was feeling a sense of loneliness, a bone deep sense of not being companioned. And part of that was a representation of what was happening in my life. I think I was going through a rough breakup or something like that. But I realized that that sensation, that feeling of loneliness or aloneness, or I was on my own and I had to figure it out, that was a very familiar feeling. That was a reliable story that I went back to again and again. And when I realized that, I realized how painful that story was, how much I had been heartbroken about that, that feeling of not being held, not being companioned, not always knowing that there was something there all the time. And so I took this struggle, I took this challenge to one of my dearest friends who I have invited to the podcast and who has promised me she will join us. Her name is Kate Becker, and she's a therapeutic breath worker. And I took this into conversation with Kate, and I was like, I feel alone. And we had an extraordinary breathwork session together. I often refer to breathwork as the big guns in this way. It's a way of accessing a different level of our thinking, of our processing, of our being. And there are many ways to do this, but breathwork is one. And it sometimes can be a way of having a new realization or planting a new seed about what is possible. And in that breathwork session, I had an unmistakable sensation. I had this extraordinary felt sense of being surrounded by, from head to toe, by a gathering, a grouping of beings. And that it was not just one circle around me, but that it was circle after circle after, that it was like being inside of a crowd. And I had this direct experience of not only was I not alone, it was impossible actually for me to be alone because there was an infinite number of beings, of these entities who were supporting and witnessing and encouraging and guiding me. And my life, my personal life, my my spiritual life, my emotional life, my intellectual life was never the same after that moment. Suddenly I understood why there are so many other traditions that have multiple deities. Obviously, Hinduism is the one I'm the most familiar with because of its connection with yoga. And we won't talk about all of the nuance of like Hinduism and how it's developed and the way that it was packaged. But just for that, like many people might be aware that they're like, oh, right, that's like a polytheistic tradition. And in that tradition, one of the things that's said is that there are, 330 million gods. And it's not that that is the exact round number. It's that that is a number that is so large that our brain can't conceive of it. And in that way, there is no difference between 330 million and infinite. But there are also many other cultures, indigenous, pagan, the Greek tradition, that has a similar structure of there are so many, not just, sort of the those beings with names, but then there are also it's an animist tradition, right? There are spirits that live in the trees and in the sky, and there are little gnomes and witches and fairies, right? Those sorts of non-Christian traditions. And we might even talk about saints inside of the Catholic tradition. But there are so many paradigms that we can see that say maybe there's more than just one. And so I love this as an invitation. And it is one of the spiritual questions, the question of principle, that I come back to when I need a reminder that it might be that what I need from a divine entity is more than I can conceive of one individual being providing. But when I think about 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 beings, because even that is too many for my brain to conceive of, when I think about that many beings that are rooting for me, that are here for my questions, that are here in my prayers, that are present with me in meditation, that are offering me guidance and suggestions and encouragement, I have a sense of ease. I'm not trying to get someone's attention because at any given moment, certainly at least one of those has the time or the presence to be with me. I also want to come back to something that my teacher's teacher, Maharaji Neem Karoli Baba, shares, which is that he used to always say sab ek, which in Hindi means all one. And it is most likely that when he was saying this, he was probably meaning it in many different ways. But one of the ways he was meaning it was that all of the names, all of the faces, all of the avatars, all the personalities of the divine are of one. And when we have access to the divine, whether it's in a sunset or as a saint or one of the deities from the Indian tradition or from an animal, or from the holiness of our own breath, or the elation of a piece of music. That all of those moments of divine experience are actually just a reflection. They are a tiny shard, a tiny fraction of this great whole that is so extraordinary that, again, our limited minds, our limited bodies cannot fully process. So the questions that I want to encourage you to live into and to reckon with, to breathe, or the questions I want to encourage you to breathe with or write or meditate on. What were you taught about God? In your own family of origin, did anybody ever talk about God or pray? Did you go to church, and what was the God inside of church? What was their personality? What did they look like? What did they do? What did they say? What are the assumptions that you developed as you were coming to being and coming to experience yourself and the world? And now, as an adult, or an adult-ish listening to this, I sort of feel like an adult-ish. What do you wish to be true about the divine? If you could, in fact, write a job description, if you could have your own magical dreams come true about the nature of the divine, what would those dreams be? That living on the edge of curiosity about the divine is such a profound experience, because I am fully of the belief that the infinite, the divine, universal wisdom, consciousness, nature, I am fully of the belief that that is beyond our conception. It's not possible for us to understand it. And so if we step into the edges of what do I wish were true? What do I pray my divinity, my relationship with the eternal? What is my secret hope that might be? It's all of that and more. That every person who's listening to this right now has their own unique and precious experience. They have their own preference. They have their own longing about what that relationship, what that feeling of profound and extraordinary, undeniable connection feels like. And they are all true. That the divine is every single one of those things and more. That the nature of the supernatural, right, is that it is more than the natural world. It is beyond our material understanding. That divinity is not limited by what we could possibly imagine. It is all of that and beyond that. So in this moment, whatever you actually need from the eternal is available. And what that means is that none of us can own God. None of us can be certain about God. None of us can ever be correct about the nature of the divine, because we could not possibly contain all of it. And that is both incredibly reassuring to me, and also very hard because my limited human brain wants certainty. And yet, over the course of history, and perhaps even in this moment in history, we are witnessing in many different traditions and experiences people offering a flavor of certainty, a flavor of correctness that is reassuring to our human system, but is a total denial. It is, in my opinion, a misunderstanding of the divine reality. So I hope you allow this question to roll around inside your curious heart. I hope that you allow it to unfold and to live and breathe as you move through your day and your week and your month. Most of all, I hope, my dear curious hearts, that you are able to find a deep and reliable connectedness to something that feels extraordinary and magical and profoundly comforting, especially in these moments. Thanks for tuning in, curious hearts. If this episode was useful, I hope you'll follow the show or leave a review or share it with somebody who you think needs it. And if you're craving support on your own spiritual path or seeking some meaningful work, you can find ways to work with me at veralester.com. Otherwise, until next time, please stay grounded in that curiosity that you've got and keep turning towards what matters. See y'all soon.